While cleaning the bedroom, I found a long blonde hair on the bed. My hair is short and dark. I said nothing. I just quietly installed a hidden camera and waited. When I checked the recording 3 days later, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think I was the kind of woman who would always know that if something was wrong in my own home, in my own marriage, in my own bed, I would feel it. Some instinct would fire. Some quiet alarm would go off in my chest. I was wrong. My name is Claire Hendricks. I was 38 years old, living in a beige colonial house in Naperville, Illinois, with a 2-car garage, a golden retriever named Biscuit, and a husband named Daniel, who coached youth soccer on weekends and made very good coffee. We had been married 11 years. We had a daughter, Maya, who was 9 and obsessed with marine biology. I worked as a hospital administrator, 40 hours a week, sometimes more. Daniel ran a mid-sized landscaping company he'd built from nothing, which I had always admired about him. We were, by every external measure, fine. That word, fine. I've turned it over in my hands 100 times since then. Fine is the color of walls you stop noticing. Fine is the sound of silence you've learned to call peace. Looking back, the signals had been there for months. I just hadn't wanted to read them. It started small. Daniel began going to the gym in the evenings, which wasn't unusual, except that he'd always been a morning person. He said his schedule had changed. He started keeping his phone face down on the kitchen counter. He laughed differently at dinner, as if his mind was running a separate conversation somewhere else. He smelled different when he came home. A little too clean, a little too deliberate, like someone who had showered at the wrong time of day. I told myself it was stress. His busiest season was spring, and spring had arrived. Then came the text message I wasn't supposed to see. We were watching TV one Saturday evening in March. Maya already asleep upstairs, Biscuit curled at my feet. Daniel's phone lit up on the armrest between us. He'd set it face up by accident. I saw the name, just a letter, K, and a single line of text before he snatched the phone and stood up, saying he needed water. "Did you see something?" I asked myself afterward, lying in the dark beside him. Or did you just want to? I chose to believe I'd imagined it. But the mind, once it starts pulling a thread, doesn't stop. 2 weeks later, I came home early from work on a Tuesday. A board meeting had been canceled. I pulled into the driveway and noticed the house looked exactly as it should. Both cars gone, Maya at school, Daniel supposedly at a client site in Joliet. I went upstairs to change out of my work clothes. That's when I found it. I was stripping the bed to put on fresh sheets, something I did every Tuesday, when I saw it lying on Daniel's pillow. A single strand of hair, long, very long, the kind that reaches the middle of a woman's back. And pale blonde, almost silvery, the kind of color that doesn't come out of our house. I have short, dark brown hair. I've had it that way for 15 years. I stood there holding the sheet, that strand curled against the white cotton like a question I already knew the answer to. The bedroom felt different suddenly. The same furniture, the same afternoon light coming through the curtains I'd chosen, the same framed photo of Daniel and me in Sedona on the dresser, and yet entirely foreign, like walking into a room and realizing it belongs to someone else. I didn't cry. I didn't call him. I didn't throw anything. I put the sheet in the washing machine, made the bed with fresh linens, and went downstairs and made myself a cup of tea. I sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around the mug, and I let myself think, clearly and quietly, for the first time in months. And then I drove to Best Buy. I purchased a small indoor security camera, the kind marketed for watching pets or checking on sleeping babies. Compact, wireless, motion activated. I paid cash. I brought it home, tucked the receipt in my coat pocket, and spent 20 minutes finding the right angle on the bedroom bookshelf between a small plant and a stack of Daniel's old paperbacks. He never noticed it. I went back to work the next morning. I made dinner that evening. I helped Maya with her homework on the ocean food chain. I smiled at Daniel across the table, and I waited. 3 days felt like 3 months. I went about my life with a strange and unfamiliar stillness. I cooked. I drove Maya to school. I sat through budget meetings at the hospital with my hands folded on the table, nodding at the right moments, saying the right things. Underneath all of it, I was calculating. That is the part no one tells you about betrayal. Not the screaming or the crying, but the cold arithmetic of it. How you lie in bed next to a person and run numbers in your head. 11 years. 1 daughter, 1 mortgage, 14 years left on it. 2 joint accounts. 1 business he'd built, which I had supported through the lean first years by working overtime and skipping vacations. I had done our taxes every April. I had remembered his mother's birthday. I had made the dentist appointments and the car service appointments, and once, memorably, I had driven 2 hours through a snowstorm to bring him lunch on a job site because he'd texted that the crew was stuck and starving. What had I missed? What had I chosen not to see? The fear arrived on the second night. Not the romantic kind of fear, the heartbreak kind, but the practical, bone-deep fear of a woman who understands what dissolution means. Financially, logistically, for Maya, I was not naive. I had sat across from enough administrators in my career to know that institutions protect themselves, and people do the same. If Daniel had been planning something, if this had been going on long enough that he'd been consulting a lawyer, moving money, setting things up, I could find myself behind before I'd even begun. I got up at 2 in the morning and went to the kitchen and opened my laptop. I started reading family law in Illinois, marital assets, discovery processes, what constitutes evidence, what a spouse is entitled to. I read for 3 hours. By the time gray light was coming through the kitchen window, I had filled 4 pages of a yellow legal pad in my smallest handwriting. I was afraid. But fear, I had learned, from years of managing crisis in a hospital environment, from code blues and staff shortages and board audits. Fear is just information. It tells you what is at stake. It doesn't tell you to stop. By the end of the 3rd day, I had the beginning of a plan. Step 1 was already in motion. The camera. Whatever had been happening in that bedroom, I intended to document it properly. Step 2 was financial. Before I said a single word to Daniel, before I confronted anyone or changed anything, I needed to understand exactly where our money was. I knew the broad strokes. Our joint checking, a savings account, Daniel's business account, Maya's 529. But Daniel handled the business finances. He used an accountant I'd never met in person, a man named Phil, whom I knew only as a number in Daniel's phone. I needed to know if there were accounts I didn't know about, assets I hadn't been told about. I wrote down every institution, every login I had access to, every statement that still came in paper form. Step 3 was legal counsel. I needed to speak to a family law attorney, alone, in confidence before anything moved. Not to file anything yet, just to understand where I stood. Step 4 was the hardest. Hold my face. Daniel could not know. Not yet. Not until I held something solid in my hands. Something he couldn't explain away or minimize or turn into a conversation about my insecurity. I had seen it happen to other women. The confrontation that happens too early, before the evidence is gathered, and then becomes a referendum on the wife's mental state. You're paranoid. You're imagining things. You need help. I would not give him that opening, so I held my face. That Thursday evening, I made pasta, opened a bottle of wine, and asked Daniel about his day. He told me about a commercial property bid in Aurora. He topped off my glass. He put his hand on the small of my back when he passed me in the kitchen. I smiled. I asked follow-up questions. I was so convincing that I almost convinced myself. That night, after he fell asleep, I checked the camera app on my phone, which I had downloaded under a different email, through the guest network on our router so it wouldn't appear on the shared account. The footage had uploaded to the cloud. I hadn't watched it yet. I pressed play. The footage was dark and slightly grainy, but clear enough. Timestamp: Tuesday, 11:47 a.m. A woman I had never seen before walked into my bedroom. Blonde, long hair, early 30s. She knew where the bathroom was without looking for it. She sat on my side of the bed and took off her shoes. I watched 22 minutes of footage. Then I closed the app, put the phone face down on the nightstand, and stared at the ceiling. I had my answer. Now I needed to decide what to do with it. The attorney's name was Susan Park. I found her through a colleague at the hospital, a woman in finance who'd gone through a divorce 2 years earlier and had navigated it, as she told me quietly in the break room, without losing her shirt. That was the recommendation I needed. I called Susan's office from my car in the hospital parking garage on a Wednesday morning before my shift started. I got an appointment for Friday afternoon. I told Daniel I had a late meeting. Susan Park's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building in downtown Chicago. Clean-lined, uncluttered. The kind of space that communicated competence without warmth. She was in her mid-50s, with precise posture and reading glasses on a chain, and she listened to me for 20 minutes without interrupting. I had brought the legal pad, the account numbers I'd compiled, and on my phone, the cloud-saved footage. She watched the relevant portion of the video. Her expression didn't change. "How long have you been married?" she asked. 11 years. Joint property? House, cars, joint accounts. He has a business. I have my salary. She nodded slowly. Illinois is an equitable distribution state. That doesn't mean 50-50 automatically, but it means the court looks at contributions to the marriage. 11 years, a child, income history. You're in a reasonable position. She set down her pen. The most important thing right now is documentation and financial disclosure. Don't move money, don't confront him, don't change behavior. Let me file a formal discovery request when the time comes. I told her about the camera footage, the hair, the phone. She advised me that in Illinois, recording in a shared marital home was a nuanced area. She would research the specifics of my setup, but that the footage, combined with financial documentation, could be useful context. I walked out of her office feeling for the first time in 2 weeks that I was standing on solid ground. I was careful. I was so careful. But Daniel had always been perceptive in the way that guilty people are, attuned to small changes, because they themselves are managing small changes constantly. I didn't know exactly when he began to sense something, but I can pinpoint the first sign that he did. It was a Saturday morning, 10 days after my meeting with Susan. I was at the kitchen table with my laptop, going through a credit card statement I'd printed. Our oldest joint card, the one we rarely used anymore, which I'd requested a duplicate statement for through the mail. I didn't hear Daniel come downstairs. When I looked up, he was standing in the kitchen doorway in his weekend clothes, watching me. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Going through receipts," I said, without hesitating. "Hospital reimbursement. I need to submit expenses from the conference in February." He looked at the paper for one moment too long. Want coffee? Please, I said, and turned back to the statement. He made the coffee. He didn't ask again. But later that afternoon, I noticed he had taken his laptop upstairs when he would normally use it at the kitchen table. And that evening, he made a phone call in the garage with the door closed. He was starting to feel it. That subtle shift in the air that a person produces when they know something and are deciding what to do with it. I accelerated my timeline. Over the next 4 days, I photographed every financial document I could access in the house. Tax returns from the past 6 years. The business and corporation papers Daniel kept in a filing cabinet in the study. Insurance policies. The mortgage statement. I saved copies to a personal cloud account he didn't know existed, and I couriered printed copies to Susan's office. And then, on a Tuesday, I came home at lunchtime. I had been watching the camera footage every evening after Daniel fell asleep. I had, by then, 4 separate recordings over a 3-week period, always between 10 and noon on a Tuesday or Thursday. Always the same woman. I had a clear image of her face. And on this Tuesday, I parked 2 streets over and came through the backyard. I didn't go inside. I sat in the yard behind the fence, in the cold, and I took photographs through the kitchen window of a woman I now knew. From a reverse image search I'd run on a screenshot of her face, was named Kristen Maurer. 31. She had an Instagram account. She posted pictures of hikes and brunches and her small apartment in Wicker Park. She had, in 6 of her last 12 posts, tagged a hiking trail 40 minutes from Naperville that Daniel had told me he visited alone for mental resets. I had screenshots of all of it. I sent everything to Susan that evening. Her reply came the next morning. 7 words. We have what we need. Call me today. I sat in my parked car in the hospital garage, phone in hand, and felt something settle in my chest that I can only describe as clarity. Not peace, not anger. Just the clean, functional feeling of knowing exactly where you are and what comes next. There was no going back now. Susan filed the divorce petition on a Thursday morning in April. I was at work when it happened, deliberately, reviewing a staffing report, coffee going cold on my desk, as if the most significant legal action of my life was occurring on a separate continent. Susan had advised me to maintain complete routine. Daniel would be formally served at his business address, which I had provided. The process server would find him at the office, not at home, not in front of Maya. I had thought of everything I could think of. He was served at 10:15 a.m. I know this because Susan texted me the confirmation. I read it once, put my phone in my desk drawer, and went back to the staffing report. By noon, my phone was ringing. I let it go to voicemail. By 12:30, Daniel was in the hospital parking lot. I know because the front desk called to say my husband was there asking for me. I asked them to tell him I was in a meeting. I was not in a meeting. I was sitting in the small conference room off the main corridor, hands flat on the table, breathing. By 2 o'clock, he had sent 11 text messages. They began as confusion. Claire? What is this? Call me. And escalated through the afternoon into something colder. I know you've been going through my files. I know about the lawyer. You should have talked to me first. This is a mistake. The last message before I turned my phone off read, "You have no idea what you're starting." That was the moment I understood that Daniel had already spoken to someone. Not a friend, a lawyer. The speed of it told me he'd been thinking about this possibility, or had been advised to prepare for it. I drove home after my shift. Maya was at my mother's for the week. I had arranged this 2 weeks earlier, telling my mother only that Daniel and I were going through a difficult time, and I needed a few days. My mother had asked no questions. She had driven 4 hours from Wisconsin without complaint and taken Maya to see a lake and eat ice cream. I walked into the house, and Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table. He looked terrible, pale, jaw tight, the particular look of a man who has been caught and is reorganizing his self-image in real time. I set my bag down, took off my coat, and sat across from him. He started with denial, then reframing. Then, when I said nothing, something shifted in his face and he became very still. "Kristen doesn't mean anything," he said. There it was, the name, given voluntarily, as if offering it might shrink the damage. "I'm not here to discuss Kristen," I said. "Claire, my attorney will be in contact with yours." He stood up. He was not violent. Daniel had never been violent, and I had thought about this carefully. But he was large, and he was angry, and the room felt suddenly smaller. He told me I was making a catastrophic mistake. He told me I didn't understand the financial reality of what I was doing, that the house would have to be sold, that I would disrupt Maya's entire life for something that didn't have to end this way. "You should have thought about disruption before," I said. He left the room. 20 minutes later, he left the house. But the next morning, something unexpected happened. Kristen Maurer called my personal cell phone. I don't know how she got the number. I answered because I didn't recognize the number, and I was already running on adrenaline, and some part of me, I think, had been waiting for exactly this. She was not what I expected. Her voice was steady, almost composed, with a current of something controlled underneath it. She told me she thought we should talk. She told me that Daniel had told her things about our marriage, about me, that she was beginning to understand were not entirely true. She told me she wasn't my enemy. I listened. Then I said, "I didn't file against you. I filed against my husband. But if you contact me again, I'll document it and provide it to my attorney." I ended the call. I didn't know whether she was sincere or strategic. It didn't matter. I had placed myself firmly outside the dynamic between the two of them, and I intended to stay there. That evening, I drove to a hotel 20 minutes outside town, checked in under my own name, ordered room service, ran a bath, and slept for 10 hours. I had earned it. When I checked out of the hotel 2 days later, I felt something I hadn't expected. Hunger. Not the desperate, ragged kind, but the steady kind. The kind that knows what it wants and is willing to wait for it. Daniel had moved into a short-term rental in Elmhurst. Susan told me this through the appropriate channels. He was represented by an attorney named Marcus Webb, whom Susan described as experienced and aggressive, which means he'll start high and will work down. She did not seem worried. I decided to take her calmness as data. The first attempt at destabilization came on a Sunday. I was gardening, or trying to, pulling up the dead growth from the flower bed along the front porch, when a car I didn't recognize pulled up to the curb. Kristen got out. She was prettier in person than her Instagram suggested, which I registered as a completely neutral fact. She was wearing a jacket that cost more than it looked like it cost, and she walked up the front path with a directness that told me she had practiced this approach. "I need 5 minutes," she said. "You were told not to contact me," I said, still holding the gardening trowel. "I'm not here for Daniel. I'm here for me." She looked at the house, then at me. "I want you to know that I didn't know he was still fully in this marriage. He told me." "I'm sure he told you a number of things," I said. "I'm not interested in comparing notes. I just want you to understand I understand everything I need to. I looked at her directly. I hope you find what you're looking for. But I need you to leave my property. She stood there for a moment. Something moved across her face. Frustration, or maybe something more genuine. Something almost like sorrow. Then she nodded once, walked back to the car, and drove away. I went back to the flower bed. What was she hoping I would do? I thought, turning the soil. Break down? Befriend her? Offer some shared feminine grievance over a cup of coffee? I felt no anger toward her. Specifically, Daniel had been the architect of this situation, and whatever version of him she had been given was not the version I had married. But I also wasn't interested in her narrative. I had my own. The days that followed had a specific quality: waiting, but not passive waiting, active waiting. The kind you do when you understand the process and trust it. I returned to work full-time. I told my direct manager, a woman named Patricia, 12 years my senior, whom I respected enormously, only that I was going through a divorce and might need occasional schedule flexibility. Patricia put her hand briefly on my arm and said, "Tell me what you need." That was enough. I didn't want pity. I wanted to be a functional human being in a functional workplace, and Patricia made that possible. I called my sister Rachel for the first time in months. We had drifted, not through conflict, but through the quiet accumulation of distance that two busy lives produce. Rachel lived in Portland with her partner and 2 boys. She answered on the second ring, and when I told her, the silence on her end lasted exactly 3 seconds before she said, "I'm coming out." "You don't have to." "Claire, I'm coming out." She arrived the following Thursday with a duffel bag and a bottle of very good wine, and the specific practical competence of an older sister who has decided something is being fixed. She didn't dramatize. She helped me sort through shared belongings, make a list of what I wanted and what I was willing to negotiate on, and sat with me while I video called Maya, who was still with my mother and had been told, in age-appropriate terms, that Mom and Dad were working through something important. Maya asked if Biscuit was okay. "Biscuit is excellent," I told her, and meant it. Daniel, through Marcus Webb, had sent a first proposal that was, as Susan predicted, ambitious in his favor. We did not respond yet. "Let them sit," Susan said. I was not frantic. I was not unraveling. I was 38 years old, and I knew who I was, and I was handling it. And somewhere, I suspected, Daniel and Kristen were watching this steadiness and finding it, in its own way, more unsettling than rage would have been. Good. Rachel had been gone 4 days when Daniel asked to meet. The request came through Susan, which was appropriate, and also, I noticed, slightly unusual, given that Marcus Webb had been handling all communications until now. Daniel had gone around his own attorney to ask directly. Susan flagged it. "He wants an informal conversation," she told me. "No lawyers, no record. I'd advise against it, but it's your decision." I thought about it for 24 hours. Then I agreed, with one condition. We would meet in a public place during the day, and I would have my phone recording audio, which was entirely legal in Illinois as a single-party consent state. I chose a coffee shop in downtown Naperville, one I'd never been to with Daniel. Neutral ground, visible from the street, a place where voices had to stay measured and faces had to stay controlled. He arrived before me. He was dressed carefully, which told me he'd thought about this. He looked like the man I had married. The same broad shoulders, the same slightly too long hair, the same hands I had held for 11 years. And I let myself feel that briefly, as something real, before I sat down. I owed myself that honesty. Grief and anger can coexist. I had room for both. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Say what you want to say," I said. He started reasonably. He talked about Maya. He said he was worried about the impact of a protracted legal process on a 9-year-old girl who was sensitive and loved both her parents. He said that he had made a terrible mistake, that he understood that, and that destroying everything over one mistake seemed, the word he chose, disproportionate. I noticed the framing. One mistake. The camera had shown me 4 separate visits over 3 weeks. The Instagram posts went back 8 months. I said nothing. I let him talk. Then the reasonableness began to shift. He mentioned, carefully, that the business had complexities that a formal discovery process would expose to unnecessary scrutiny. He mentioned that he'd spoken to Phil, the accountant, and that there were things in the business structure that were complicated. He said this in a way that was meant to sound like a warning delivered with regret. "Are you telling me something illegal is in the business structure?" I asked. "I'm telling you it's complicated," he said, "and that opening it up could create problems for both of us." There it was, the soft edge of a threat wrapped in the language of shared concern. "Both of us," I repeated. "You're still a co-owner on paper," he said. "If the business gets scrutinized—" "Daniel," I set my coffee cup down. "If there's something in the business that doesn't hold up to scrutiny, that is your problem, not mine. My attorney is aware of all relevant documentation." His jaw tightened. "You've been copying files." "I've been protecting myself." "Claire." He leaned forward. The careful tone was fraying at every edge now, the rehearsed calm giving way to something raw underneath. I watched it happen the way you watch weather change, not with fear, but with the specific attention of someone who has been studying the sky long enough to read it. "I'm trying to give you an out here, a clean agreement, fair split. We handle it ourselves, and Maya never sits in a courthouse." "My daughter is not a negotiating point," I said. There was a silence. Something passed through his face, the reasonableness finally giving way. And what came beneath it was the look of a man who was used to resolving problems through charm and had just run out of it. He had spent 11 years learning which register of his voice moved me. He was running through all of them in real time and finding none of them worked anymore. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said quietly. "No," I said. "You made it hard 11 months ago." I picked up my bag. "Susan will hear from Marcus." I walked to my car and sat in it for several minutes, hands in my lap. My heart was going fast. Not from fear, exactly. I want to be accurate here. But from the specific physiological response of having been threatened and having held your ground anyway. The adrenaline of it. The strange, exhausting aliveness of it. What if he was right about the business? What if there was something there that could be used to pressure me or drag me into something I hadn't known about? The thought moved through me like cold water. What if you didn't know everything? What if you only thought you did? I called Susan from the parking lot. She listened. Then she was quiet for a moment and she said, "He's bluffing. A co-owner who was uninvolved in day-to-day operations and had no knowledge of any irregularities has very strong protections. He's trying to scare you." A pause. Was there anything specific he said? A number? A name? Only Phil the accountant. "I'll subpoena the business records in full," Susan said. "If there's something there, we find it ourselves, on our terms." I sat in the parking lot for another few minutes after we hung up. I was frightened. I will not pretend otherwise. There is a particular loneliness in the moment when you realize that someone you shared a bed with for 11 years is willing to use your legal exposure as a lever. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It made the coffee shop, the careful clothes, the measured voice, all of it, suddenly feel like the surface of something I should have seen sooner. But it also made something else happen, which I can only describe as the door closing behind me. Any last residual tenderness, any ghost of the question, "Are you sure about this?" disappeared completely and without ceremony. The fear became fuel. It always does, if you let it. I drove home. I made dinner. I called Maya and told her I loved her and that I would see her soon. I was sure. The business records arrived in Susan's office 3 weeks later, following a formal court-ordered discovery request that Marcus Webb had attempted twice to delay or narrow. The delays told us something. The attempts to narrow the scope told us more. Phil, the accountant, whose full name was Philip Graves, as it turned out, appeared, on paper, as a business consultant retained by Daniel's company for strategic financial advisory services. He had been paid, over the past 4 years, a total of $214,000 in fees that were logged as operating expenses. That was not, by itself, unusual for a business of Daniel's size. What was unusual was that Philip Graves was Kristen Mauer's uncle. Susan found this in 40 minutes using public records and LinkedIn. She sent me a message at 11 at night that read simply, "Call me in the morning." I called her at 7. The structure, as Susan laid it out, was not sophisticated, which somehow made it worse. Unsophisticated schemes carry their own particular insult. They suggest that the person who built them didn't think you were worth a more careful lie. Daniel had been routing money through Phil's consulting fees, a portion of which had made its way through a secondary account to a shared expense account that Daniel and Kristen had apparently maintained. It wasn't a massive amount, not a movie amount, but it was money that had come out of our marital estate over 4 years, used to finance a relationship I hadn't known about. Hotel stays. A weekend in Montreal that Daniel had told me was a landscaping trade conference. Dinners. The hiking jacket that cost more than it looked. "Is this criminal?" I asked. "That's not our immediate lane," Susan said carefully. "What it is, in the context of divorce proceedings, is dissipation of marital assets. In Illinois, a court can compensate the other spouse for dissipated assets. We are going to ask for a full accounting." The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday. I wore the gray blazer I kept for the most serious hospital board meetings, the one that made me feel, as my mother once said, like someone who has read everything in the room. I arrived 15 minutes early. I sat at the table beside Susan, arranged my water glass, and looked around the courtroom with the deliberate calm of someone who has prepared and knows it. The fluorescent light was flat and neutral and indifferent to everyone in the room equally, which I found, oddly, comforting. Daniel arrived with Marcus Webb and, I noticed, without Kristen, a fact that registered as a small, interesting data point. The last few weeks had apparently created some distance between them. There had been an Instagram post she'd deleted. A mutual friend had told Rachel, who had told me. I had filed that away without leaning on it. Marcus opened by attempting to reframe the consulting payments as legitimate business expenses with proper documentation. Susan let him finish. She did not interrupt, did not sigh, did not telegraph anything. I had come to understand that this particular quality, the willingness to let a weak argument complete itself, was one of her greatest professional assets. Then she presented the documented relationship between Philip Graves and Kristen Maurer. She presented the secondary account. She presented 8 months of time-stamped hotel receipts, 2 airline tickets, and a restaurant record from Montreal, all cross-referenced with dates from my camera footage and Daniel's phone records, which had been obtained through formal discovery. The room had a specific quality of silence after that. Not the silence of surprise, but the silence of something landing that everyone present had been waiting to land. Daniel was very still for most of it. Then he leaned over to Marcus and whispered something. Marcus requested a recess. The judge, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses and the expression of someone who had seen this particular architecture of deception before, granted 15 minutes. During the recess, I sat at the table and drank water. Susan reviewed notes. I looked once at Daniel across the room, standing near the door with Marcus, head bent low, talking in clipped tones. He looked like a man who had arrived at a card game with a hand he thought was unbeatable and was looking at the table realizing he had been wrong. I watched him for exactly as long as I needed to confirm that he was shaken, and then I looked away. I didn't need to watch anymore. Did it feel good? Someone asked me later. My sister, actually. I thought about it honestly. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like accuracy, like a long, painful calculation had finally come out to a correct number. The satisfaction was real, but it was quiet. It was the satisfaction of having done the work. When the session resumed, Marcus attempted a revised position, that the financial arrangements had been informal, that no deliberate concealment had been intended, that the figures were being blown out of proportion. The judge looked at him for a moment, then she looked at the documents. She read something on the page in front of her with the careful attention of a person who has not yet decided and is making sure. Then she set it down. Then she asked Daniel directly whether he disputed the relationship between Philip Graves and Kristen Maurer. There was a pause that lasted longer than any pause in that room should have. No, Daniel said. It was one syllable. But it was the syllable the entire 11 months had been building toward. The syllable that turned a private humiliation into a public record. The syllable that meant it was over. The final settlement took 6 more weeks. That may sound anticlimactic. 6 weeks of paperwork after the pivot of a courtroom admission. But the law moves in its own rhythm, and I had learned to respect that rhythm rather than fight it. Susan moved efficiently. Marcus Webb's initial aggression had been substantially deflated by the Graves-Maurer documentation, and Daniel, it turned out, had far less appetite for a protracted public fight once the concealment was on the record. He was not a bad man, I had decided. That sounds like an odd thing to say, and I say it carefully. He was not a good man, in the ways that had mattered during those years. But bad men usually want the destruction. Daniel wanted the exit. He had wanted an easier life, and had tried to build one secretly alongside the one we shared. He had been selfish and dishonest, and he had cost me something I would never fully calculate. But when the structure he'd built collapsed, he didn't fight the rubble. He stepped out of it. The settlement gave me the house. This had been my primary requirement from the first conversation I'd had with Susan, and it had been non-negotiable from that moment to this one. Maya had grown up in that house. Her heights were marked in pencil on the doorframe between the kitchen and the mudroom, a small archive of years, the kind you cannot pack into a moving box. Her name was in the concrete of the back patio, pressed in by a 4-year-old hand the summer after we moved in. I was not giving that up. I had told Susan this in our first meeting, and I had never wavered, even when Daniel's initial proposal had listed the house as a shared asset to be sold. That proposal had lasted one exchange. I received the house outright. Daniel signed his equity interest to me as partial satisfaction for the documented dissipation claim. I received a structured buyout of my share of the marital savings, paid in installments that his accountant, a new accountant, not Phil Graves, whose business relationship with Daniel had ended quietly and quickly, certified could be sustained. I received full primary custody of Maya, with Daniel having visitation on a schedule that Maya herself had, in age-appropriate consultation, helped design. My daughter was 9 and surprisingly pragmatic about it. She wanted to stay in her school, she wanted biscuit, she wanted both parents at her birthday. All of these things were possible. I had made sure they were possible before I agreed to anything else. The dissipation finding, the court's formal acknowledgement that marital assets had been used to fund an extramarital relationship, resulted in an additional compensatory award. It was not an enormous sum, but it was real and documented, and it meant that what Daniel had done was not simply private moral failure. It was on the record. It had a number attached to it. That mattered in a way I find difficult to articulate, except to say that being believed by a system, in a document, in ink, is its own form of resolution that no private acknowledgement quite replaces. Philip Graves, the accountant, Kristen's uncle, lost the consulting contract, obviously. More significantly, the financial irregularities flagged during discovery were referred to the Illinois Department of Revenue. That was not something I had requested specifically. It was a consequence of the records being opened. I neither celebrated nor mourned it. It was simply what the audit trail led to, the natural downstream consequence of a system doing its job. As for Kristen, she had sent one final message through an intermediary, suggesting she wanted to explain herself. I did not respond. I held no particular feeling about her, not rage, not sympathy, not even much curiosity anymore. She was someone who had made choices with imperfect information, perhaps, and would live with the shape of those choices. That was her life, not mine. I had spent enough of my energy in directions that didn't belong to me. Daniel moved to Denver 6 weeks after the settlement was finalized. He had a landscaping connection there, apparently, a business opportunity he described to Maya with the specific enthusiasm of someone who needs to believe in a fresh start. I wished him nothing. Not good luck, not bad luck, just the emptiness of his absence, which I found was not as painful as I had expected. The house breathed differently without the weight of what had been hidden in it. I signed the final papers on a Wednesday afternoon in Susan's clean, uncluttered office. She offered her hand. I shook it. "You were very steady throughout this," she said. "That matters. Courts notice it." I thanked her. I meant it more than she probably knew. Steadiness had not come naturally through those months. It had been a daily decision, renewed each morning, sometimes each hour. It had cost something, but it had also built something. I could feel the difference between the woman who had stood in that bedroom holding a white sheet and the woman who now stood in a law office shaking her attorney's hand. Same person, different foundation. I drove home. I picked up Maya from school. She showed me a drawing she'd done of a blue whale with anatomically improbable teeth and explained at length why whales technically have hair, which makes them mammals, and I listened to every word. That evening, I made dinner in my kitchen, in my house, with my daughter at the table doing homework, and Biscuit asleep on the floor between us. It was quiet. It was entirely mine. That was enough. The first summer after the divorce was the summer I remembered how to be myself. I don't mean that in a grand way. I mean it in the small, cumulative way that life actually works. A Saturday morning when I woke up and had 3 quiet hours before Maya woke up, and I sat on the back porch with coffee and the birds and the particular silence of a house that belongs to you, and felt, for the first time in longer than I could track, that the silence was comfortable. Not the silence of things unsaid, the silence of things settled. I planted a garden, a real one, not the neglected flower bed along the porch, but a raised bed vegetable garden along the back fence, 3 beds wide, with tomatoes and basil, and a hill of zucchini that promptly tried to take over the world. Maya named the largest zucchini Gerald. We ate Gerald in a frittata in late July, and she delivered a small eulogy. I got a promotion. This had been in discussion before the divorce, but the timing aligned itself, as timing sometimes does, with the moment when the noise in my personal life had finally quieted enough for me to bring my full attention back to my work. Patricia put my name forward for Vice President of Operations, a role that had been vacant for 6 months while administration debated restructuring. I interviewed in May. I started the new role in September. The salary increase was meaningful in ways I don't need to enumerate, except to say that the house, which I might once have worried about maintaining alone, no longer felt like a precarious proposition. I started running again. I had run in my 20s and early 30s and had stopped somewhere in the middle years of marriage, when time had a way of filling itself without my supervision. I started slowly, 2 miles, then 3, then 5, and ran the Naperville Half Marathon in October with Rachel, who had trained in Portland and complained loudly for the last 3 miles, and crossed the finish line 8 seconds ahead of me, which she reminded me of for the rest of the trip. Maya joined the swim team. She was not fast, but she was determined, and she approached each meet with the same systematic optimism she applied to everything. She spent the winter building a marine biology project on deep-sea bioluminescence that won 3rd place at the regional science fair and earned her an invitation to a summer program at the Shed Aquarium. I watched her accept the certificate and felt something I'm not sure there's a word for, something beyond pride, something in the register of witnessing. Daniel called on Maya's 10th birthday. He had moved to Denver as planned, and the Denver venture had not gone smoothly. I learned this not from him, but from a mutual acquaintance who mentioned it without drama. The landscaping contact had fallen through. He was doing contract work. He sounded, on the phone, smaller than he once had, and older. He was appropriate and brief with Maya. She was, as I said, pragmatic. She told him about the science fair. He said he was proud of her. Kristen Maurer had returned to Chicago from what her social media, which I no longer monitored, but which Rachel monitored with the dedicated attention of a woman who considers it a civic duty, suggested had been a period of significant personal upheaval. She and Daniel had apparently separated before he left for Denver. The Instagram account that had once documented hikes and brunches had gone quiet for several months before returning with a notably different tone. Less curated, fewer locations, more of the kind of reflective posting that suggests someone reorganizing their sense of self. I found I had no feeling about this, not satisfaction, not sympathy. She was a stranger to me. Philip Graves, the accountant, had been audited. The Illinois Department of Revenue had found discrepancies that extended well beyond Daniel's business. He had apparently been creative with other clients' finances as well. His license was under review. This I did not follow actively. Susan sent me a brief note when the proceedings became public, as a professional courtesy. I read it once. What I thought about in the quiet evenings on my back porch was not any of them. I thought about the woman I had been before I found that hair. The woman who had told herself that fine was enough, that silence was peace, that she could maintain a life on the energy of not asking. I felt tenderness toward her. She had been doing her best with the information she'd allowed herself to have. I made different choices now. I said what I thought more often. I asked the questions I actually wanted answers to. I made plans for myself, not around another person's schedule or approval, but originating from my own sense of what I wanted. It sounds simple. It is not. I planned a trip to Costa Rica with Maya for the following spring. She wanted to see sea turtles. I booked it in October, a full 6 months out, with the specific pleasure of someone who is learning to move toward things rather than just around them. One evening in November, I was walking Biscuit through the neighborhood after dinner, Maya's bike light bobbing ahead of me on the path through the park. The sky had that particular Illinois October into November quality, steel blue and enormous, the last of the leaves still holding, and I thought, I didn't think it would feel like this. Not perfect, not healed exactly in the way that word suggests no scar, but solid, built on actual things. Mine. Biscuit stopped to investigate something in the grass with total commitment. Maya looped back to wait for him. I stood there in the cold, in the fading light, in my life. It was more than fine. Finding that hair changed everything. But what truly changed my life wasn't the betrayal. It was the moment I decided to trust myself enough to act. I learned that evidence matters more than emotion. That steadiness is its own kind of power. That the most dangerous thing you can do to someone who expects you to collapse is simply not to. A life rebuilt on truth will always hold more weight than one built on comfortable silence. If you found that hair on your pillow, what would you have done? Tell me in the comments. Share this with someone who needs it. Thank you for listening. You're stronger than you know.